"We're running behind schedule," Karen announced, microphone in hand, her designer blazer perfectly pressed. She marched across the community center, grabbed my disabled father's wheelchair handles, and started pushing him toward the exit. When he tried to stand to protest, she actually shoved him. He stumbled, his oxygen tank toppling as his glasses shattered on the floor. I'll never forget the look on her face 3 weeks later when she walked into courtroom 302 and realized the disabled man she'd dragged out of that town hall meeting was my father, and I was the federal judge assigned to her case. My blood boiled as I helped him outside. "It's okay, Sophia," he wheezed, but nothing about this was okay. Dad had lived here for 30 years, long before the fancy HOA took over. He'd raised me alone in this house after Mom died, working double shifts as a teacher to put me through law school. What Karen didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't just Dad's daughter. I was Sophia Chen, newly appointed federal judge to the district court. Karen had no idea she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. 2 weeks later, I helped Dad settle into his favorite armchair, a stack of legal documents spread across his coffee table. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his hands trembling slightly. Not just from Parkinson's, but from worry. "Because your mother always said you were more stubborn than a mule. I wonder where I got that from," I replied, squeezing his shoulder. Since the town hall incident, I'd been working tirelessly. What I found shocked even me, and I'd spent years prosecuting white-collar criminals. Karen Winters and her board had been systematically targeting Oakwood Estates' elderly and disabled residents. They created impossible standards, harassed vulnerable homeowners with violations and fines, forced them out, then flipped their properties for massive profits. The pattern was unmistakable. First came the citation for non-conforming vegetation. Dad's beloved rose garden, planted with Mom before she passed. Then improper exterior paint tone, though his house had been the same color for decades. Finally, the safety hazard notice about his wheelchair ramp, which they'd initially approved. 7 elderly homeowners had already been pushed out, including Dad's best friend Mr. Gonzalez, who'd lived next door for 20 years before violations forced him to sell last year to Karen's real estate developer husband at 40% below market value. I pulled out the financial records my investigator had obtained. "Look at this, Dad. They've been diverting HOA funds into a consulting company owned by Karen's sister. Nearly $200,000 missing from the Community Improvement Fund. But the most damning evidence came from Karen's own emails, obtained through a subpoena in a related case. "We need to accelerate the transition in Zones 3 and 4, she'd written to her husband. "Focus on the old-timers first. Most don't have the resources to fight back." Zone 3 was my father's street. Dad studied my face as I organized the evidence. "This isn't just about me, is it?" "No," I admitted. "It's about justice. Filing a civil suit would take years." Then fate intervened. The Oakwood Estates HOA was already involved in a federal discrimination case, filed before my appointment to the bench. When random case assignment happened, the file landed on my desk. I knew I should recuse myself given Dad's situation. But after reviewing the case details, I realized dozens of vulnerable residents were being systematically targeted. I could remain impartial about the facts while ensuring justice was served. My assistant judge, Miguel, whistled low after reviewing my findings. "This isn't just HOA overreach, Sophia. This is fraud, discrimination, and elder abuse." That evening, I noticed a black SUV cruising slowly past Dad's house. Through the windshield, I caught a glimpse of Karen staring intently at the property, phone in hand. When she spotted me watching from the window, she quickly drove away. The next day, Dad received another violation notice, this one threatening immediate legal action for his unauthorized medical equipment visible from the street. His oxygen tank. "They can't be serious," Dad said, his voice tight with anxiety. "I need this to breathe." I took the notice, adding it to my growing file. Don't worry, they won't get away with this. That night I faced a critical decision. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for Monday. I'd followed every judicial guideline regarding potential conflicts, documented my reasoning, and consulted with colleagues. Still, a voice in my mind whispered, "Should you really be the one to hear this case?" My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Patterson, the 80-year-old widow across the street. "They're putting a lien on my house tomorrow. I don't know what to do." Then came an email from my clerk with a bombshell discovery. Karen's husband had already filed permits to build luxury condos on what were currently the homes of 6 elderly residents, including my father's property. They weren't just pushing people out. They'd planned the whole neighborhood's transformation, targeting the most vulnerable first. My decision was made. This wasn't about revenge, it was about stopping a systematic campaign against people who couldn't fight for themselves. Monday morning arrived. I straightened my judicial robe, reviewing my oath of office, equal justice under law. Today, that promise would be tested. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Sophia Chen," the bailiff announced. I took my seat at the bench, maintaining perfect judicial composure as Karen Winters and her attorney entered the courtroom. She was impeccably dressed in an expensive suit, radiating the same arrogant confidence she'd shown while manhandling my father. She hadn't noticed me yet, too busy whispering to her lawyer. Then her head snapped up, her eyes widening as recognition dawned. The color drained from her face. "Good morning," I said, addressing the courtroom. "We're here today in the matter of Williams versus Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association." Karen leaned frantically toward her attorney, whispering urgently. I continued, "Before we begin, I want to address any potential concerns about impartiality. My father is a resident of Oakwood Estates." Her attorney immediately stood. "Your Honor, given this connection, we request that you recuse yourself." I nodded, having anticipated this. "I've reviewed the judicial guidelines thoroughly. My father is not a party to this specific case, nor does he have any financial interest in its outcome." What I said next was completely by the book, but the timing couldn't have been more perfect. In the interest of complete transparency, I should mention that I was present at a community meeting 2 weeks ago, where I witnessed Ms. Winters physically removing a disabled resident from the proceedings. That resident was my father. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Karen's attorney looked stunned, turning to stare at his client. Just then, my clerk hurried in, passing me an urgent note. "Emergency filing from defendants. Allegations you threatened Karen after meeting. Requesting immediate hearing with Chief Judge." It was a complete fabrication, a desperate attempt to remove me from the case. I glanced up at Karen, who now wore a smug expression. She thought she'd won. She didn't know I'd already requested the security footage. "The court will take a brief recess while I review this emergency filing," I announced, maintaining my composure despite the blatant lies Karen had submitted under oath. In my chambers, I reviewed the sworn affidavit describing how I had supposedly accosted her after the town hall meeting and threatened judicial retaliation. My clerk Jessica stood nearby, barely containing her outrage. "She's desperate," Jessica observed. "And sloppy. She didn't realize we have security camera footage from outside the community center." I raised an eyebrow, and Jessica smiled. "I took the liberty of subpoenaing it yesterday. It clearly shows her pushing your father and you helping him into his wheelchair. There's no confrontation, no threats from you." When court resumed, Karen sat with renewed confidence, whispering to her board members. She thought her false accusations would force my removal from the case. She was wrong. "Counsel, serious allegations have been made about my conduct," I began calmly. "Fortunately, we don't have to rely on conflicting recollections." I nodded to the bailiff, who wheeled in a monitor. "This security footage from outside the Oakwood Estates Community Center was obtained through proper legal channels yesterday. The courtroom fell silent as the video played. It clearly showed Karen physically pushing my elderly father, causing him to fall, while I rushed to help him. There was no confrontation between Karen and me, just me helping Dad back into his wheelchair and reattaching his oxygen. Karen's face drained of color as her fabricated story unraveled before the entire court. Her attorney looked blindsided. "Given this evidence," I said, "I'm denying the motion for recusal. Furthermore, I'm referring Ms. Winters to the State Bar for potentially submitting false statements to the court under oath." Karen's attorney quickly requested a brief recess, which I granted. During the break, I noticed him arguing intensely with Karen in the hallway, their heated whispers echoing off the marble floors. When court resumed, her attorney approached the bench. "Your Honor, my client wishes to explore settlement options." "That's certainly her right," I replied. "However, given the serious nature of the allegations in this case, I believe we should proceed with today's scheduled testimony first." What followed was devastating for Karen and the HOA board. Witness after witness testified about their discriminatory practices. Mr. Gonzalez, now using a walker, described how Karen had fined him for a medical ramp similar to my father's. "When I couldn't pay the fines, they put a lien on my house," he testified, his voice breaking. "The house where my children grew up, where my wife died. I had to sell to her husband for half what it was worth." The forensic accountant was next, methodically detailing how HOA funds had been diverted to businesses connected to Karen and her family. Over 3 years, approximately $328,000 was transferred to Winters Consulting Group, a company owned by the defendant's sister that provides no verifiable services to the community. During a brief recess, Karen's attorney approached me again. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to offer significant concessions to settle this matter." I maintained my judicial demeanor. "That's between you and opposing counsel. The court has no position on settlement negotiations." By late afternoon, the evidence was overwhelming. Even Karen's own board members were distancing themselves, whispering among themselves and avoiding her gaze. The final witness was Mrs. Patterson, the 80-year-old former civil rights attorney who lived across from my father. Despite her advanced age and the walker she used, her voice rang clear through the courtroom. "I've been fighting discrimination for 60 years, she testified. "I never expected to face it in my own neighborhood in my 80s from people who look like me." She described how the HOA had specifically targeted homes owned by elderly residents, creating rules impossible for those with limited mobility or fixed incomes to follow. "It wasn't about beautification," she concluded firmly. "It was about pushing us out so they could redevelop our homes. They counted on us being too old, too sick, or too poor to fight back." As she stepped down from the witness stand, she paused beside Karen. "Shame on you," she said, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. By day's end, Karen's carefully constructed facade had crumbled completely. Her attorney requested another emergency conference, this time practically begging for settlement talks. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning," I announced. "I expect counsel to use this time productively." That evening, I visited Dad to fill him in on the day's proceedings. He was in his garden, tending to the roses that the HOA had repeatedly cited. "You should have seen her face, Dad," I said, helping him water the far corner. "I thought she might faint right there in the courtroom." Dad chuckled, but then grew serious. "Just make sure you're doing this for the right reasons, Sophia. Your mother and I didn't raise you to seek revenge." I set down the watering can. "This isn't about revenge, Dad, it's about justice. Not just for you, but for Mr. Gonzalez, Mrs. Patterson, everyone they've targeted." Dad nodded slowly. "In that case, give 'em hell, sweetheart." The next morning, settlement was reached within an hour. The HOA agreed to a complete restructuring of the board. financial restitution to affected residents, and 5 years of court-supervised oversight. Karen resigned from the board, facing separate investigations from the district attorney's office for fraud and elder abuse. 2 months later, I sat with Dad on his front porch, watching neighborhood children play on the newly installed accessible playground where Karen's ornamental water feature had once stood. The roses in his garden bloomed freely, no longer subject to arbitrary restrictions. Across the street, Mr. Gonzalez was moving his belongings back into his old house, one of several former residents returning thanks to the settlement fund. "I'm proud of you, Sophia," Dad said, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for mine. "Your mother would be too." Just then, a moving truck rumbled past. Through the passenger window, I glimpsed Karen, her perfect hair now showing dark roots, her face tight with anger as she glared at my father's garden. Then she noticed me sitting beside him and quickly looked away. Dad chuckled. "Some people never learn." "Maybe not," I agreed, "but some lessons have to be taught anyway." The new HOA board held its first meeting the following week. The newly elected president, Mrs. Patterson, called the meeting to order with a tap of her walker. "Our first order of business is to approve the new bylaws, emphasizing inclusion and respect for all residents, regardless of age or ability." The vote was unanimous. "You know what the best part is?" Dad whispered to me. "Karen's perfect house just sold for 20% less than she paid for it." Sometimes justice has a sense of humor too.